Thank you very much for joining us. Iran has reported an accident at its main nuclear facility at Natanz. Tehran's atomic agency says it affected the site's electrical distribution grid. Power was out across the facility's above-ground workshops and underground enrichment halls. On Saturday, President Hassan Rouhani said Tehran had launched new advanced enrichment centrifuges at the site. This is after several centrifuges were damaged in a fire last year, an incident Tehran called an act of sabotage. And Iran is high on the agenda as the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd visits Israel. Tensions in the region have been escalating in recent weeks.
The Tehran of today poses a strategic threat to international security, to the entire Middle East, and to the State of Israel. And we will work closely with our American allies to ensure that any new agreement with Iran will secure the vital interest of the world, of the United States, prevent dangerous arms race in our region, and protect the State of Israel.
Harry Fawcett is in West Jerusalem, and we'll have more on the U.S. Defense Secretary's visit in just a moment. But first, we go to our Tehran correspondent, Assad Beg. Assad, so what more are Iranian authorities saying about this accident at the Natanz facility?
Well, let me just update you with the latest that we're hearing. Now, a written statement has been given by the head of Iran's atomic agency to the Iranian media here, Ali Akbar Salehi. Now, what he said is an admission that this is not an accident, this is an attack. Now, he didn't use those words, but what he said is today's act against the enrichment facilities shows the failure of those that oppose Iran's nuclear progress. It also shows the failure of those that oppose Iran's negotiations to have those sanctions lifted. He went on to say that the international community and the IAEA must confront this nuclear terrorism and that Iran has a right to respond to those behind the attack and those that ordered it. Now, this has come after we first initially heard that this was an incident. It was being investigated. We thought it was an accident, but suspicious nevertheless. Some lawmakers here said that there was a possibility that it could have been sabotage or infiltration. Now, this is the head of Iran's atomic organization, clearly now saying that this is more than just an accident. This is an attack. And It comes just a day after Iran gave the news that it was using advanced centrifuges to enrich uranium.
And this is coming as the U.S. is about to resume nuclear talks with Tehran on the 2015 nuclear deal. How might it affect the discussions and negotiations?
Well, it's definitely going to complicate matters if Iran feels that it is being under attack by Israel, because that's where the finger is being pointed, although lawmakers and Ali Akbar Salehi haven't pointed directly at Israel. But earlier this week, on Tuesday, an Iranian ship was attacked in the Red Sea, and from reports, Israel is said to be behind that. Now, Iran's nuclear facility has been attacked before. There's an act of sabotage, according to the Iranians, last year in the summer. But again, Iran wants to go back and wants these sanctions lifted. And Ali Akbar Salehi is saying that this act is carried out by those that oppose Iran's negotiations and oppose those sanctions being lifted. So it will definitely complicate those talks and make them even more difficult than they already are.
Thank you very much for that, Assad Beg, live for us there in Tehran. Let's get the view now from Jerusalem and speak to Harry Fawcett. Harry, as Assad said there, Iran seems to be pointing the finger of blame at Israel. And I know this Iranian nuclear issue is featuring high on the agenda of discussions between Israeli leaders and the visiting U.S. Defense Secretary, but they're not on the same page when it comes to the Iranian nuclear issue.
Very much not. And this is the key difference between what was there under the Trump administration and the situation now that President Biden has been sworn in. And not just on the same page between the US and Israel. It's not clear that all of the Israeli government is on the same page, given what we heard at the top of the show from the Defense Minister Benny Gantz. Now, of course, he's in this very uneasy coalition with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. They're bitter political rivals. They've just fought an election campaign against each other. And so while Gantz is talking about working with the US to ensure that any deal meets Israel's needs and expectations, Benjamin Netanyahu has been talking very vociferously, as he long has for many years, against any idea of such a deal. Israel has reportedly put some very strict criteria behind what it would accept, but they're so strict from the Israeli perspective that it's very unlikely that any of them, or at least not all of them, could be met in any deal going forward. And so what he's been saying at the same time as these talks have been going on in Vienna last week is that any agreement that would pave the way for Iran to have a nuclear weapon in the future is one that Israel would not be bound by. And so obviously that's talking about freedom of action in the context that we've just been hearing. Now, the meeting that we've had today between Gantz and Lloyd Austin, the US Secretary of State, has been one which they've been talking fairly positively about the long-standing Israeli-US alliance, talking about plans for future military acquisitions in the future. And so this is what Lloyd Austin had to say.
Our commitment to Israel is enduring and it is ironclad. And I pledge to continue close consultations in order to ensure Israel's qualitative military edge and to strengthen Israel's security.
And Harry, as Assad in Tehran alluded to, this is coming at a time of maritime conflict, a shadow maritime conflict anyway, playing out between Israel and Iran. Is that likely to feature in the discussions in Israel?
Well, yes, I mean, there have been discussions already and more to take place. And yes, that is part of the context that Netanyahu and others have been talking about, that there have been these reports that for some time now Israel has been acting militarily, covertly, to interrupt Iranian ships taking oil to Syria. And then we've had in February and March 2 Israeli-owned vessels in the Arabian Sea that have been attacked. Israel reportedly, or at least seems to believe that is an Iranian attack in both cases. And then last week, this explosion under the waterline of the Saviz vessel, a cargo ship used by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And again, very fast turnaround of leaks being reported in the New York Times in this instance that Israel was responsible for that. No official confirmation of that from the Israeli government, obviously. But this is the key thing, that Israel appears to be taking these measures against Iran at the same time as the United States is talking about resuscitating the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. So it will be very interesting to see when Austin has his meeting with Netanyahu on Monday, whether Netanyahu, like Gantz did, talked about trying to make the best of a deal, or whether he maintains this very hard line against the very idea of it.
Thank you for that, Harry Fawcett, live for us there in West Jerusalem. Well, let's discuss all this further now with Hassan Ahmadian, who's an assistant professor of Middle East and North African Studies at the University of Tehran. He's joining us via Skype from the Iranian capital. Thank you very much for being with us. A lot to talk about. Let's start with this incident at the Natanz facility that Iran reported today. Certainly very worrying every time there's an incident at a nuclear facility. And now, in the last hour, the Iranians describing this as an attack. If they're saying this is an attack, first of all, how much damage do you think could have been sustained here?
Well, it's not clear what happened exactly at the facility. Obviously, there are conflicting reports, but Salih's latest remarks suggest that there has been an attack. We don't know what kind of attack. Is it a cyber or an act of physical sabotage? We don't know that. We are yet to hear about that. But obviously, the conclusion is that there is an act of sabotage, and obviously the Israelis are to blame in such circumstances, because previous incidents have pointed to Israel as well. So it has a track record of doing. Well,
there is no proof right now as to Israel's responsibility, but certainly, as you say, Iran in the past has blamed Israel for such attacks. There was a fire at the Natanz facility last year, which Tehran blamed on Israel. This is all coming as the nuclear talks are about to resume with the United States, trying to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. If it is an attack and an act of sabotage, as the Iranians are saying, how might it affect their position in the negotiations?
This can potentially have a negative effect on the negotiations. Obviously, the Israelis have an interest, and they have, announced time and time again that they would not like to see the JCPOA being revived and the United States getting back to its commitments in the JCPOA. So the Iranians will be asking themselves whether these kinds of attacks are in coordination with the United States or not, because previously, during the negotiations leading up to the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, the United States has proved that it can put a cap on the Israeli activities, assassinations within Iranian nuclear facilities or against its scientists.
Right.
But now, obviously, the Israelis are increasing their attacks, but there is no acts on the part of the United States.
You keep talking about Israel, and the Iranians certainly keep talking about Israel as being responsible of what they're calling act of sabotage. But Israel is not the only country that has concerns about the resumption of the 2015 nuclear deal. The Saudis are also very wary.
It's not only about the intention, it's about the capabilities. The Israelis, many believe in Iran, many believe that the Israelis and the United States are the only parties that are capable of doing these kinds of attacks within Iran. The Saudis didn't show previously any such capabilities. So the points are the blame is pointed to the Israelis or the United States in another scenario. But obviously, taking the current negotiations, indirect negotiations between Iran and the United States into account, it's easy to conclude that the Israelis, who are on their toes on the revival of the JCPOA, are willing to do something to affect that negatively.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for bringing us a viewpoint from Iran there. Hassan Ahmadian joining us from Tehran. Thank you for your time.